We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Zayin Amud Aleph in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 67a. This daf is sponsored by Sean Kashani. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or a daf, see the description box below, and please see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said, anytime you have a situation of a Kiddushin where there is no Aveira, so the child follows the male. Meaning to say, for example, let's say a Kohen marries a Yisraelis, the child is going to be a Kohen in that situation. The child will follow the father. And the Mishnah said this is a general rule all the time. And now the Gemara is in the middle of asking a question. Rabbi Shimon, probably Reish Lakish it refers to. Reish Lakish asked the following question to Rabbi Yochanan, is that really a rule? We can find an exception to the rule as follows. Ger shenasa mamzeres. Let's say you have a situation of a ger, a convert, that marries a mamzeres. Diyesh kiddushin ve'ein aveira. In that case, there is kiddushin in that situation, and it's not an aveira. And the halach over there is havlad holech achar hapogam. The child follows the one who is blemished, meaning to say that in that situation, the child is going to be a mamzer. The child will actually follow the mother. That seems to be an exception to the rule. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, ger shenasa mamzeres. If you have a ger that marries a mamzeres, havlad mamzer divrei Rabbi Yossi. The child is a mamzer according to Rabbi Yossi. So again, according to Rabbi Yossi, it seems that we have an exception to this rule of the Mishnah. And the Gemara says, Amar Le, he said to him, Rabbi Yochanan responded, Misavrit Masnisan Rabbi Yossi, do you think that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Yossi? Masnisan Rabbi Yehuda, our Mishnah actually follows Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar Ger Lo Yisa Mamzeres, he says that a ger is actually not allowed to marry a mamzeres. V'yesh Kiddushin v'yesh Aveira, therefore it actually falls into the category of Kiddushin with an Aveira. And in that situation, the Mishnah already said, Havlad Holech Achar HaPogam, that the child follows the Pogam, the child follows the one who is blemished, meaning here there is an Aveira, and that's why the child follows the one who is blemished, and the child is a mamzer. And the Gemara says vinisnia. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, if you're going to say the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, you have a different question. Because why don't we just include it then in the Mishnah? We gave a bunch of examples of various cases in the Mishnah. Why isn't this case included? We should have a case in the Mishnah, an example of the Mishnah of a ger that marries a mamzeres, that's an example of Kiddushin with Aveira, where the child follows the pogam. And the Gemara says to that, Tana kol makom d'seifa le'suye. It says the word kol makom at the end of the Mishnah, meaning when it's discussing this type of situation of yesh kiddushin v'yesh aveira, it says any situation, and kol makom does come to include some cases that are not brought in the Mishnah, meaning not every case is brought in the Mishnah, and this case would be included as well within the kol makom. Any situation like that includes other cases that were not mentioned. And the Gemara continues, if you want, I could say another answer. Liolam Rabbi Yossi, really the Mishnah does follow Rabbi Yossi. And this case really is an exception. Because again, according to Rabbi Yossi, a ger is permitted to marry a mamzeres. V'tana ezuzu l'me'ute. But what does it say? It says ezuzu to exclude it, meaning to say that sometimes it says these are the examples, and there are some exceptions. Meaning the Gemara is saying the language of the Mishnah does imply that there are some exceptions to the rule. That's what the word ezuzu means, and so that's exactly what the Mishnah is saying. The Mishnah said anytime you have a situation of kiddushin that's not with an aveira, you have this rule, but ezuzu, here are examples, there are exceptions to the rule. And Rashi explains, ger shenasa mamzeres diyesh kiddushin ve'en aveira. Again, according to Rabbi Yossi, a ger marries a mamzeres, there's kiddushin but no aveira. The ger mutter b'mamzeres l'Rabbi Yossi. Because according to Rabbi Yossi, a ger is allowed to have a relationship with a mamzeres. The Amar kahal gerim lo mikri kahal. Because Rabbi Yossi says that the congregation of gerim, that's not called the congregation. The prohibition is that a mamzeres is not allowed to enter into the congregation, but the kahal gerim is not called kahal. L'kamon b'perek basra, that's later on in the last perek. The Gemara said, if our Mishnah follows Rabbi Yehuda, so then it should include this case in the list, because this should be one of the situations of Kiddushin with Aveira, together with, for example, Amona to Kohen Gadol. And the Gemara said, Kol Makom the Sefer di Yesh Kiddushin v'Yesh Aveira. When it says Kol Makom by Yesh Kiddushin v'Yesh Aveira, Kol Makom Klola Mashma. Kol Makom implies that it's a general rule. La Suye Hach the Lo Parash Lavahedya, that comes to include this case, which is not explained explicitly. And then the Gemara said, or you could say, the Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi. That says that a ger is allowed to be with a mamzeres, and therefore it belongs in the first case of the Mishnah, a case where there's kiddushin with no aveira. With the kasha loch kololahi. Now that which you're saying, is this really a general rule? No, masnisin lav klal chayil. Our Mishnah is not a general rule that applies everywhere. According to this approach, there are exceptions. To lahachi tana ba ve'ezuzu. That's why the Mishnah says here here are some examples. Ve'ezuzu, he kohenes u'levia v'chulu. Again, a kohenes, let's say, marries kohenes levia Yisraelis, marries a kohen lev in Yisrael. L'meimrat, that means to say, dehani hu davlad holech achar hazachar, that in these examples, the child follows the male, avol yesh acherim, but there are other situations, afal b'sheyesh kiddushin ve'ein avera, even though there is kiddushin with no avera, havlad holech achar hapagim, that the child will end up following the one who is more blemished. And the Gemara continues, Ve'ezuzu v'sulo, but is it really true that when it says ezuzu, it means these are the examples and there are no other examples? Because that's essentially what we're asking within this answer. We're saying that we're following Rabbi Yossi, and ezuzu means to say these are the examples and no others. But that's not really true. V'arei cholol shenasa bas Yisrael. What about a situation of a cholol who marries a bas Yisrael? Diyesh kiddushin ve'ein avera. It's not an avera. There is kiddushin in that case, but it's not an avera for a cholol to marry a bas Yisrael. The prohibitions that are involved in terms of cholol, let's say chalola is not allowed to marry a kohen, but a cholol can marry a bas Yisrael, and in that case, havlad holech achar hazocher. In that case, that's consistent with the rule. The child will follow the male in that situation. And the Gemara says, Holokasha, no, that's not difficult. Rav Dustoi ben Rabbi Yehuda Svirlev, because our Mishnah holds like Rav Dustoi ben Rabbi Yehuda. And Rashi explains, Ve'ezuzu v'sulo, are these the examples? When it says Ve'ezuzu, means there's no other examples. Kilomar imkain, meaning to say, if you're going to say this, De'ezuzu dafka, that Ezuzu means only these examples and no others. Aval midi acharina lo azil achar hazacher, then it sounds like you're saying by all other cases, we would not follow the male. Gabe yesh kiddushin ve'ein avera, by the case of yesh kiddushin ve'ein avera, the first case is in the Mishnah. V'harei cholol, but what about a cholol? U'tanan l'kamon, we learned in the Mishnah later on, bas cholol zachar, if you have a situation of a daughter of a cholol, meaning to say the father is a cholol, psula lekahuna, she's actually psula, she's disqualified from the kahuna. Alma achar hazachar, you see that we follow the zachar in this case. Again, it's consistent with the rule. Umikri chalala, and this daughter is considered to be a chalala. So you see again, by a cholol shenasa bas Yisrael, it's yesh kiddushin ve'ein avera, and it follows the male, because the daughter is considered a chalala. And the Gemara says to that, our Tana in our Mishnah, Reb Dustoi Svirle, follows the opinion of Reb Dustoi, meaning L'Tana Didon, to Amar Benos Yisrael Mikva Tahara L'Chalolin, meaning our Tana that says that the Benos Yisrael is considered like a purifying mikvah for Chalolim, and meaning to say Uvita Kasheira L'Kuna, that actually the daughter is Kasheira L'Kuna in that case. The daughter does not follow the father in this case, according to Reb Dustoi, and therefore this also is an exception to the rule. And the Gemara continues, V'arei Yisrael shenasa chalala, but what about a case the other way around? Let's say the father is Yisrael, and he marries a chalala. That's also an example, Diyesh kiddushin ve'ein avera, there's kiddushin, there's no avera in that case. And in that case, certainly, havlad holech achar hazachar, the child does follow the male, follows the father, is not considered to be disqualified in any way. And so therefore, according to that, again, this is consistent with the rule. So this goes against what we're saying, that ezezeh, or ezuzu, ends up excluding every other case. And the Gemara says to that, Tana kol makam dereisha lasuye. Well, for that, it does say kol makam at the beginning of the Mishnah. And since it says kol makam, that does come to include some case that's not listed. And so therefore, kol makam is coming to include Yisrael shenasa chalala. We're not excluding every single case that's not listed. And the Gemara says, well, v'nisniya behedya, but still, why not list it? If we're listing all cases, and then the cases that are not listed are excluded, why not list this case as well? And the Gemara says to that, the reason why we don't list Yisrael shenasa chalala is mishum delo masnila, because it's not easy to learn that in a short fashion. It wouldn't be easy to put that into the Mishnah. Because hechi nisni, because how are we going to learn it in the Mishnah? How would we put it into the cases? The way the Mishnah is phrased is, kohenes ulevia v'yisraelis v'chalala, a kohenes levia yisraelis and chalala, shenitzes lekohen levi v'yisrael, that marry a kohen levi v'yisrael. That's how you would include it. If you wanted to include chalala, you would just put it in with the other women that are getting married, kohenes levia v'yisraelis, and you would add in chalala, that marry a Kohen, a Levi, or a Yisrael. But the problem is you can't phrase it that way, because v'chalala l'Kohen, michazia, because is a chalala even allowed to marry a Kohen? It's not true. A chalala is allowed to marry Yisrael, but a chalala wouldn't be allowed to marry a Kohen, so it wouldn't fit in with the words of the Mishnah, so it's better just to include it in within the Kol Makom. And Rashi explains, v'harei Yisrael shenasa chalala, what about a Yisrael that marries a chalala? The yesh kiddushin ve'en avera, again, there is a kiddushin there, there's no avera for Yisrael to marry chalala. The lo asura ela l'kohanim, Kohanim, as we said, a Chalala is only Asura. She's only forbidden to Kohanim. She's not forbidden to a Yisrael, not forbidden to a Levi. V'havlad holech achar hazocher. And in that case, the child certainly follows the male. The child would be kosher lekahuna. The Tanan lekaman, as we learned in the Mishnah later on, Bito ksher lekahuna, his daughter is ksher lekahuna. V'lo amrin and chalala hi kipagam shevishneim. We don't say that she takes on the status of her mother and she's considered like a chalala in this case. V'nisnia behedyan. So then the Gemara said, well, why not have it learned explicitly in the Mishnah? Gabe kohenes levi of Yisraelis, meaning by kohenes levi and Yisraelis, put in chalala umeshani. And the Gemara answers, as we just saw, mishum de lo masni lo ina nishnis lo latana im hashar beloshen katzer. It can't be learned with the Tana with the rest of the cases in a short language. The name of Ve'ezu Kohenes Levi of Yisraelis v'chalala, because the way you'd want to say it is put the word chalala at the end of that sentence. Kohenes Levi Yisraelis and chalala shenasu lekohen leLevi v'Yisrael the mashma chalala nami lekohen in avera. That would imply that a chalala can marry a kohen without an avera, but again, that's not true. It is an avera. And the Gemara continues, Va'ika de Rabba bar bar Chana, but there's another example of a case of Yesh Kiddushin ve'ein Aver that's consistent with the rule. That's the case of Rabba bar bar Chana. The Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabba bar bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Mitzris Rishona. Let's say you have a second generation Mitzri that marries a first generation Mitzris, B'nosh Shlishi have it. The halacha is that the child is considered to be a Shlishi, meaning to say, again, it's consistent with the rule. The child follows the father. And the Gemara says, Tana kol makom dereisha le'asuye. Again, the Tana says kol makom at the beginning of the Mishnah to include this case. And the Gemara says, Ulu Rav Dimi, but what about according to Rav Dimi? Not everybody agrees in this case of Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Mitzris Rishona. So what about according to Rav Dimi, Do Amar Sheni have it? Rav Dimi actually says that in this situation, the child is actually considered a Mitzri Sheni, not considered to be in this particular situation a Shlishi. So according to that, the child is actually following the mother's side in this situation. And the Gemara says, well, according to Rav Dimi, Tana Ezuzu L'Mu'ute. The Ezuzu is then going to exclude this case. Instead of saying Kol Makom is including it, we're saying it's excluded. And Rashi explains, Va'ika Yesh Kiddushin Ve'en Avera. Again, we have another example of Yesh Kiddushin Ve'en Avera, the Havlad Holech Achar HaZocher, that the child follows the male, Had Rabba bar bar Chana. That's the case of Rabba bar bar Chana. And the case is, again, Mitzri Sheni. What's a second generation Mitzri? That means Shenis Gayer Aviv. What it means is that his father converted, so he's considered to be a second generation Mitzri. And Mitzris Rishona means Shenis Gayer Ahi. If the mother's a Mitzris Rishona, that means she's the one that converted. And Rashi continues, B'no Shlishi, so there we say that her child is considered to be a Shlishi, meaning follows the father, Umuterli, so Yisraelis, according to that, once he's considered to be a third generation Mitzri, so then he's actually he's actually permitted to marry a Jewish woman. Kedechsev Dor Shlishi, that's what it says in the Pasuk, the third generation, referring to exactly this case. Dor Shlishi, Yavo Lahem, the third generation, is allowed to marry Yisraelis. The Kaven the Yesh Kiddushin Ve'en Avera, because since this is a case of Kiddushin without an Avera, Leveis Avosam Karina Beike Yisrael. So then we say Leveis Avosam, we follow the father, just like a Yisrael, and in this case again, the father is second generation, so the child will be third generation. And Rashi says that which we say in Yevamos, Lahem Holach Achar Psulan, that we follow their psul, we actually follow the one that's disqualified. Hainu Lenin Yisrael Shenasa Mitzris. That's talking about in a situation, let's say a Yisrael marries a Mitzris, or the other way around, a Mitzri Shenasa Yisraelis, or let's say a Mitzri marries a Yisraelis, because over there it's a different situation. There, the Yesh Kiddushin V'yesh Avera. There it's Kiddushin, but there's also an Avera involved. You're not having a situation of a Mitzri of one generation marrying a Mitzris of another generation. You have a situation instead it's a Yisrael or it's a Yisraelis. So there at Shlosha Doros, again, there's an Avera until the third generation. Havlad Holech Achar HaMitzri. So there we say that the child actually follows the Mitzri. The V'yivoldu Lahem Ksiv, that's what it says. V'yivoldu Lahem V'achareim Holchim Havlodos means the children follow them. Inyan Mitzri Mitzris, but when it comes to again a Mitzri marrying a Mitzris, Lo Migmar Lan Hai Lahemidi, there we don't learn anything from the word Lahem, to Habitar Vayu Lahem Karina Be, because they're both called Lahem, Vahu Mitzri Vihi Mitzris, and he's a Mitzri and she's a Mitzris. And then the Gemara said, well, what about according to Rav Dimi's opinion? Well, Rav Dimi the Amar Biyavamas with Perika Arel. What about according to Rav Dimi and Perika Arel, the Sheni, who he actually says that in that case the child's considered a Sheni, we actually follow the mother. V'yolif Lama Asher Yivoldu learns it from Asher asher yivoldu hakasav talu beleda lemeimer devaser ime shadinan. We have it all depends on the birth, meaning it goes by the mother midich lochsiv asher yolidu, because it doesn't phrase it as asher yolidu. So again, according to Rav Dimi, it seems to be an exception, and the Gemara says indeed it is an exception, and it's an exception from the phrase in the Mishnah of ezuzu. And the Gemara continues, Vayika, but don't we have the following case that is an exception in the situation of Yesh Kiddushin Ve'ein Aveira, and that's the following case. D'chiyasa Ravin Am Rabbi Yochanan, when Ravin came, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Ba'umos, when it comes to the nations, this will be explained later on, Halach Achar HaZachar, you follow the male, and Nisgairu, if they convert, Halach Achar HaPogam Shabishneim, so then you follow the one that's blemished among both of them, and so there you see by Nisgairu, which again, it's a mutter relationship, there's no Aveira, but still we're following the Pogam. And Rashi explains, Va'ika gabe yesh kiddushin ve'en aveira, again, by the first cases of the Mishnah, by the cases where there's kiddushin with no aveira, havlad holech achar hapogam. We have a situation where the child is not following the male, but following the pogam. Hadachiyasa ravin be'umos holech achar hazachar, again, by nations. So then you say you follow the male. What that means is ish v'isha haboim mishnei umos. Let's say you have the husband and the wife. They come from different nations. Kidla kamon. This will be explained later on. Nisgairu. Now, if they convert, the yesh kiddushin ve'en aveira, that is a situation where there's kiddushin with no avera. Havlad holech achar pogam. Again, the child is following the pogam. Kidel kamon b'shmaitin, like later on we're going to say in the sugya. Umasnis and tani havlad holech achar azachar. Again, this seems to be an exception because in our Mishnah it says the child follows the male. And again, the Gemara answers to this. Tana ezuzu lemuute. The Tana says ezuzu, that comes to exclude this exact case. This in fact is an exception. And Rashi explains, Tana ezuzu dereisha lemuute. Again, it says ezuzu in the beginning of the Mishnah to exclude this case. Ulashmin and demasisin lo klal l'kayil. Again, teaching us that our Mishnah is not a full rule that applies everywhere. There are exceptions. Umei reisha demilse de Ravin lekalak shuye. Now, you can't ask from the first case of Ravin, meaning in the case where they did not yet convert. So in that case, we actually are following the male. So we could ask the following question: L'meimar v'nisnia b'masnisin. That why don't we have this case in the Mishnah? Gabe havlad holech achar azachar. By the case where it says the child follows the male, that part of the halacha seems to be consistent with the first case, so it should be listed. And the answer to that is no, we're of course not going to list that, because the masnisin b'yesh kiddushin ma'iri, because our Mishnah is talking about a situation where there is kiddushin, and if they haven't yet converted, there's no kiddushin. V'hani delonis gairu ein kan kiddushin. And in these situations where there was not yet a conversion, that's that first case of Ravin, so there's no kiddushin, so that certainly wouldn't be included in the first case of the Mishnah. And the Gemara explains, Hai Mai, again, how can you say that this Mishnah follows Rabbi Yossi? I'amrit b'shlama masnisin Rabbi Yehuda. If you're going to say correctly that the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, so then we can work it out. Kol makom dereisha la'asuya Yisrael shenasa chalala. The kol makom at the beginning of the Mishnah, that comes to include the case of a Yisrael that marries chalala. That's consistent with the first rule in the case of Yesh Kiddushin Ve'en Aveira. Uda Rabba Bar Bar Chana, it also comes to include the case of Rabba Bar Bar Chana by the Mitzrayim. That's also consistent. And Ezuzu L'Mu'ute de Rav Dimi V'Ravin, and Ezuzu comes to exclude the case of Rav Dimi and Ravin. And Rashi explains, Hai Maya Sugya Deshmaitin Parach, we're asking on the Sugya in general. Deshaninun La'el V'Bayasem Rabbi Yossi. Here again, we answered earlier that it could be the Mishnah's Rabbi Yossi. I'amrit b'shlama Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara is now saying, if you say it's Rabbi Yehuda, to Amar Ger Aser b'Mamzeres, who says that a Ger, it's forbidden to be with a Mamzeres, that's a prohibited relationship. Lafigach b'no holech achar ha'pogam, that's why the child follows the pogam, and the child is considered to be a mamzer. Kedin kol makom sheyesh kiddushin v'yesh avera, like any situation where there's kiddushin and avera. So ika l'trutze, so then you're able to answer, you can explain the Mishnah, kol makom demasisin le'suye mai ve'ezuzu le'mu'ute mai, what's kol makom of the Mishnah including, what's ezuzu excluding. Kol makom duration, we'll say, as the Gemara just said, kol makom at the beginning of the Mishnah, la'asuye Yisrael shenasa chalala, that would include a Yisrael that marries a chalala, devito kashera, the daughter over there is kashera, and we say follows the father. The havlad holech achar azachar, again the child follows the male in that case, and also comes to include the Rabba Bar Bar Chana, again according to Rabbi Yehuda would include the case of Rabba Bar Bar Chana, that's also consistent. Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Mitzris Rishona, again you have a Mitzri Sheni that marries a Mitzris Rishona. Diyesh Kiddushin Ve'ena Avera, there's Kiddushin in that case and no Avera. Lefika Chavlad Shlishi, that's why the child is considered to be a Shlishi. In that situation we say that the child follows the father, and the father was a Mitzri Sheni, the child is a Shlishi and permitted to marry into the community. The Ezuzu L'Mu'ute de Rav Dimi de Ravin, and then again according to Rav Yehuda the Ezuzu comes to exclude include Rav Dimi and Ravin. Kilomar ve'ezuzu dereisha, meaning to say the ezuzu at the beginning of the Mishnah, the mashma avol bialma lo azal achar azacher. That sounds like only these cases, but other cases we don't follow the male. So isvira le kerev dimi, if you're going to hold like Rav Dimi, the af mitzri sheni shenasa mitzris rishona, meaning if you hold like Rav Dimi, that when a mitzri sheni marries a mitzris rishona, b'na sheni, that in that case we actually follow the mitzris, and the child is considered to be a sheni, it's not consistent with the rule. So ashmeinon ezuzu masnisin lemuute. So then comes the Mishnah. The ezuzu of the Mishnah is coming to exclude that case. Hadalo azal baster zachar. That in this case we're not following the male. V'chol makom dereisha lo teisi eli yisrael shenasach halola. And then you'll say that the kol makom at the beginning of the Mishnah is only coming to include the case of Yisrael that marries a chalala, uchid Ravin, and like Ravin says, do amar nizgairu halach achar apagam. That says again that in a situation where they convert, let's say you have this situation as we said above, where you have the different nations, which we're going to describe, which we're going to discuss later on. So it said again by nisgairu, which is also a situation of yesh kiddushin ve'en aveira. If they convert, there's a kiddushin and there's no aveira, v'lo azal achar zachar, and we don't follow the male in that case, v'af agav de'en aveira, and even though there is no aveira, so again that case will not be included in the beginning of the Mishnah. V'isvira like Rava Babrachana, and again, if we hold like Rava Babrachana, by the case of the Mitzri Sheni that marries a Mitzri Rishona, Ma'isinon le mikol makom dereisha. So again, then that case is included, it's consistent, and it's learned from the kol makom of the Reisha. Ve'ezuzu lemuute de Ravin lechuda, and ezuzu will exclude only the case of Ravin, again by the nations, by the case where they're nisgairu, where they convert, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Zayin Amud Beis.